Hey everyone, welcome to a special edition of Ask an Architect. Here we are today at the ACSA Administrators Conference, and we have a special Academy edition of Ask an Architect. Here with me right now is Lynne Dearborn from UIUC. Lynne, thanks for joining the show today. Glad to have you on. So Lynne, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
I am a professor at the University of Illinois, and I teach undergraduate and graduate design studios. I also teach a new class, which is a survey of the research relating environment and health.
Okay, great. One of the things I noticed about you, Lynne, when I was kind of looking up your background is that you have an extensive educational experience. You went to RPI, University of Oregon, and University of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, is that? Or Wisconsin, Milwaukee. Can you tell us a little bit about each of those stages of your education?
So I went to RPI as fresh out of high school, 18 years old, always knew I wanted to be an architect, and got a very good, I think, professionally focused education in a 5-year program. Along the way, I sort of knew that I wanted to do other things before I settled down. So while I was in school, I actually worked in a co-op position for Exxon in Rockefeller Center for a semester. And then one summer I went and worked for an architect in Los Angeles near Compton, part of LA. So I had some, interesting experiences. I'm originally from Maine, so it was very different set of experiences than what I grew up with. But I also knew that, there's a whole world out there that other of my students that went to school with me were going to Rome, going to Copenhagen to study, and I didn't want to do that. Sure. So when I finished, I applied for the Peace Corps, and I ended up going to the Fiji Islands, and I was half of the Department of Architecture at the Fiji Institute of Technology when I was only 3 years out of an undergrad 5-year program. But it really changed my whole perspective on what is important about the built environment and what we as architects should be doing with our professional experience.
That's one of the most interesting parts of your background, I think, is that Peace Corps experience, and it makes your background really unique. But as we were talking earlier, it really drove the next stages of your career and where you ultimately ended up focusing on. So can you tell us a little bit more about how the Peace Corps shaped the next 10 years of your career?
So I knew that I wanted to be a licensed architect because I think that was sort of put out there for me as the thing to do when I was an undergrad. It was a professionally focused program. This is what architects do. And so when I came back from the Peace Corps, I went to my home state of Maine. I worked with a number of firms doing a lot of publicly funded work because that's the kind of work that there is in Maine, and particularly at that point in time. So I did a lot of school work, did some small health facility work, and some housing, some expensive housing, as well as...
What isn't these days?
Right. But it also pays the bills. So, so it was a balance of those different kinds of projects. Ultimately, and that was in a time period, so the the later 1980s, when there was a lot of more visible homelessness than I think there had been in the past. It was related to many different things, but there was also a pretty substantial economic downturn at that point, and so I thought about my Peace Corps experience and this idea that we as architects should be doing a lot more than we are. So, building schools, designing fancy houses, those are all things we can do, and I think we should be doing well. But there's a whole segment of what architects should be doing that they weren't doing at that time, which is really trying to understand what our role is in providing good housing a good solid base for families that aren't in the market, right? So I went to the University of Oregon because at that time they had what was called the Center for Housing Innovation, and I studied with some people there, really focusing much more on housing that was built or developed by not-for-profit organizations. And I ended up during that time also working for the State Housing and Community Development Agency as kind of the translator between architects and not-for-profit entities. And so I was a design reviewer, but there wasn't formal design review in the what was then the partially the low-income housing tax credit program was just getting started then. So it was Oregon's consolidated funding cycle. So like 9 different kinds of funding projects would be reviewed for all those at one time. Sure. And so I was the design reviewer, but there really wasn't a formal design review requirement. And so it ended up being kind of a point where I was trying to get architects to understand the needs of the clients as well as the needs of future residents.
One of the kind of consolidating themes that we've spoke about and you mentioned a couple of times is community. So all of the work that you were just describing kind of relates to improving the community and bettering it through architecture. What's your ultimate goal when you think about, the fulfillment of your career in achieving success in community improvement? What's the ultimate goal for you? How do you define success in community building?
Well, I think for me it is because I'm an educator, getting architecture students to see a role for themselves in that process, and to not think of it as necessarily just utilitarian. We have creative abilities. We can inspire people through what we do. So at the same time that we're meeting basic needs, I think we also need to be aspirational about what we're doing in those communities. I also think because many of architecture students don't come from low-income communities, and that giving people experience in how to listen well, particularly when there may be some holding back by people in the community thinking, well, I'm talking to an educated individual, I don't really know anything. In fact, the community members that my students work with are educators, right? They are teaching my students about what their daily lives are like, what it's like to live in these communities, what is it like to live in a place where you don't feel safe letting your kids go outside, and what is an architect's role in that. And I think, in some sense we as a profession have to understand a lot more about the processes that go into a place becoming not a great place to live, but also how do we turn that around? What's our role in turning that around? So for me, success would be having architects and others, allied professions, really being involved in turning communities into better places for people to live.
I'd like to talk more about your students that you were just talking about. You're at UIUC, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. What's happening right now at UIUC that is a fantastic thing to talk about and to tell our audience? And why should people come to UIUC? What's great right now?
So one of the things these are some things that I'm involved with, but we are a member of the AIA Design and Health Consortium, and I happen to be the principal lead from the design side. I also have a health partner from kinesiology. And so we are heavily involved in looking at how design can improve health outcomes, particularly with a focus on communities that are underserved by architects. And so that's one of the things. And I am in the program area called Health and Wellbeing. We have a concentration in our graduate program in that area. There's a number of faculty teaching the similar courses to what I teach, slightly different, but focusing on different aspects of sensory design, design for persons with disabilities, and so on. We also are part of a larger interdisciplinary effort. So last spring, I had a studio that collaborated with a planning studio, and that followed in the heels of a landscape architecture studio working in the city of Peoria. And we were, again, particularly focused on issues of health and the environment, but working in several low-income neighborhoods where, for example, just thinking about making the neighborhood more walkable, more safe routes to schools, safe routes to parks. That was the planning students component, but my students were actually able to learn a lot about that and build on that. So we looked at a neighborhood, the architecture group looked at a neighborhood where combined sewer overflow is a huge problem. And so my students were looking at green stormwater infrastructure in an underserved neighborhood at the same time that we were thinking about how you revitalize a neighborhood where there's a lot of vacant land, not great housing, a lot of disinvestment.
It's interesting. I'm glad to hear you kind of really talk about some of the niche work you guys are doing there, because I think some of our students or some of our folks who are looking at graduate schools in particular, they've started to identify exactly what they want to focus on and what they want to research or study. And so knowing the kind of specialties that you all offer, I think, is important and really helps people identify why they specifically might want to choose UIUC for their additional studies. Speaking to your students at UIUC right now, if you were to kind of give a couple overarching points of advice, looking back on your career and thinking, where you were at that stage of life, what would you say? What pieces of advice would you give?
First of all, you're really young and you have so much of life out there, and I think don't feel as if you have to rush into this job and it's going to be the job for life.
So patience.
Patience, absolutely, and looking at every opportunity that comes along as an opportunity, seeing what comes from it, and what every opportunity you can learn from. So figure out what it is that you're learning. When that's played out, then it's time to look for the next opportunity. And that's kind of, I have had a really non-traditional path through the world, I would say. And it's partly because I operate under that sort of way of living. And so, I worked for one of the largest corporations in the U.S. for a brief time early on and realized this is not great. This is not the kind of thing that I want to do. For some people, it's a great thing. But I also had a lot of other experiences, and they all, I think, helped me to be more knowledgeable and more focused on what architects can do to really make the world a better place.
Each experience informed the next and helped you make further decisions down the road. Lynne, well, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to end on something a little fun we do called 60 Seconds of Awesome. So what's going to happen is Natalie's going to put 60 seconds on the clock for us, and I'm going to ask you a series of rapid-fire kind of preference questions. This or that, black or white, dog, cat, and you let me know what your preference is. Sound good? All right, so we're going to do this as fast as we can. And Natalie, 60 seconds on the clock, please. And here we go. Architect from history you most admire.
Frank Lloyd Wright.
Vinyl records or vinyl windows?
Vinyl records.
New urbanism or old urbanism?
Old urbanism.
Negative space or positive attitude?
Positive attitude.
Favorite textile?
Linen.
Jimmy Fallon, Jay Leno, or Johnny Carson?
Johnny Carson.
Postmodernism or post-it notes?
Postmodernism.
Frank Gehry or Gary Busey?
Ooh. Frank Gehry, I guess.
Steel or aluminum?
Steel.
Best architectural entry, the Louvre or the Apple Store, Manhattan?
Apple Store.
Part T or Part 1?
Part T.
Architectural record or Architect magazine?
Architect magazine.
The Fibonacci sequence or the golden ratio?
The golden ratio.
And trash paper or trace paper?
Trash paper.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Appreciate having you on the show. And again, coming to you from ACSA Administrators Conference, special Academy edition of Ask an Architect. See you next time.